So, in talking about starting up a new aquarium, it's always worth asking first, why can't you just use plain old tap water? Everyone's familiar with chlorine and chloramine, the various dangers of tap water, but we tend to use these terms like, oh, you can't use tap water because it's got chlorine in it, without ever actually asking, like, what is chlorine? Why do water conditioners work? Et cetera, et cetera. So, what is so bad about tap water? Well, chlorine and chloramine are water preparation chemicals used by water companies to prevent bacterial infections in the populace. Basically, they kill off bacteria in the water. Now, the trouble with that is that both chlorine and chloramine are going to be quite toxic to fish. We don't want any of that getting into the tank, to say nothing of what it's going to do to our beneficial bacteria colonies in the aquarium. It's important to note with these two chemicals that either one can be used by municipal water companies. And while chlorine is going to evaporate over time, chlorine is a gas, chloramine does not. Chloramine is basically a liquid. So you can have a bucket with a little bit of chloramine in it in your water, and you can leave it out for days, and it's never going to, it's never going to evaporate. So then the question becomes, how do we get rid of chloramine? Typically, the way that you're going to get rid of chloramine is through the use of a chemical conditioner, which should be concentrated. That's going to be important. We don't want to have a water conditioner that you have to use 2 cups of in order for it to be effective. It should work very quickly. We shouldn't have to use a water conditioner and then wait a day. That's useless. We were going to do that anyway, whether just to get rid of chlorine or to equalize the temperature, all that fun stuff. So we want to be able to use the water right away. It shouldn't alter other water parameters. If you have a water conditioner that changes your pH around or changes your GH around, then that's going to cause you some problems down the road. Certainly, we want to be able to alter all of our water parameters separately as much as possible. And finally, it should not leave behind toxic NH3. Now, the reason that happens is chlorine, like I mentioned, is a gas. That's 2 chlorine atoms stuck together into a gaseous form. Now, when we break those down, we break them apart, then they sort of float away and they become 2 non-toxic chloride ions. They are relatively benign, so we don't really care about them past that. They're gone. However, when we break down chloramine, chloramine is 3 chlorine atoms, boop, 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 stuck together with a nitrogen ion right there in the middle. Now, when we break that down, the chlorine atoms, they go away, and that nitrogen, which is just raring to get into trouble, grabs itself a couple of hydrogens, boop, 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 and becomes ammonia. So if you don't do something about that ammonia, then it's just sitting around in your water. Certainly, eventually your bacteria colonies are going to use it, but in the meantime, it's toxic to your fish. It can burn their skin. It's no good. So whatever water conditioner we use, we want it to deal not only with chlorine and chloramine, which any reducing agent is going to break down chlorine and chloramine, but we also want it to deal with what happens afterward. We want to be thinking not only about the immediate effect, but also the ramifications of that. So, next up, ammonia. What is ammonia? Well, most of us are most familiar with ammonia from fish waste. Of course, fish produce ammonia directly from their gills, and really anything that rots in the aquarium is going to break down into ammonia at some point. And as I mentioned, it is produced from the breakdown of chloramine. So you can actually get ammonia in your tap water just normally, or you can get ammonia after you've introduced a reducing agent, like a water conditioner, to break down chloramine in your tap water. So how do we get rid of ammonia in tap water? There's a couple things you can do. One, you can leave that for the beneficial bacteria. The trouble with that is that beneficial bacteria, while it is absolutely vital for an aquarium, doesn't work incredibly fast to pull ammonia out of the water. So there could be an hour or 2 hours after adding ammonia into the tank where it's capable of harming the fish. You can also chemically absorb ammonia using a filter media. Something like zeolite can remove ammonia directly. Now, that's a little bit of an expensive way to remove the ammonia, but certainly it's possible, especially if you have something like fish in a bag, or you're transporting fish in a larger bucket, or you don't have the option of setting up beneficial bacteria colonies. Or you can always bind ammonia as a non-toxic chemical. If you have a good water conditioner, your water conditioner should do that for you, and you shouldn't have to ever think about this. So, all of that said, let's take a look at some conditioners. So, as the pictures have been hinting at, Seachem produces many different water conditioners. The star of the conditioners line is, of course, going to be Prime. Prime is very, very concentrated. It's treated at a rate of 5 milliliters per 50 gallons of water. That works out to about 2 drops per gallon. And it will permanently remove both chlorine and chloramine. Now that works almost instantly. So normally what I tell people is, if I put the Prime in the bucket first, and then I fill the bucket with water, by the time the bucket is full, all of the chlorine and chloramine has been completely removed. So this is going to detoxify ammonia and nitrite for 48 hours. Now, it's important to take a look at some vocabulary terms here. Detoxify is not the same as remove. When we detoxify ammonia and nitrite, we're doing so by binding them into a form which is chemically similar, but is not going to harm the fish. So a water test will still report that you have ammonia or nitrite in your tank, because the chemical that it's being bound as is similar enough to the original chemical that it kind of fools your water test. However, it's not dangerous to your fish, and it is still useful to your bacteria colonies. The bacteria colonies can still use up the ammonia and nitrite just the same way they did, the non-detoxified form. So it does not interfere with your cycling process. It does not harm bacteria. In fact, we found that most people will tend to have their tank cycle much faster when they're using Prime than when they're not. This also boosts slime coat production. So this doesn't artificially coat a fish in slime. That's undesirable for a lot of reasons, but it helps the fish to produce their own natural slime coat, which of course helps heal wounds and prevent infections. Next up, we've got Safe. Safe is like the powder version of Prime, quote unquote. It is even more concentrated than Prime. A quarter teaspoon of Safe treats 300 gallons of water. Now, that sounds like a really, really great thing, and certainly for big aquariums, we really recommend Safe. However, trying to dose anything smaller than about 100 gallons of water becomes quite difficult, because of course, it is possible to overdose something like Safe, and we don't want to be doing that, to a customer's tank, for example. So I really recommend Safe for great big aquariums, for large store systems, but if someone has a tank that's 100 gallons or smaller, I strongly recommend Prime. It's very concentrated all on its own. So like Prime, Safe is going to permanently remove chlorine and chloramine almost instantly, and it's going to detoxify ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate for 48 hours. Now, we actually have a couple of other water conditioners that I'll just sort of mention. I don't have slides for them. Many of you are going to be familiar with the Aquavitro line. In the plant line, we have Premier. Premier is designed to remove chlorine and chloramine, but leave the ammonia that's produced from the breakdown of chloramine in a form which is immediately usable by the plants. So basically, it breaks chloramine down into a form which is beneficial to the plants rather than just, benign, which is what Prime does. Alpha in the saltwater line is essentially super concentrated Prime. I want to say it's 1.5 times more concentrated, and it doesn't smell as strongly as of sulfur. So very handy. A lot of the stores that I've spoken to have preferred to use Alpha for that reason, because when you're using water conditioners a lot, the smell does start to become notable, as it were. We've also got a product in the Jurassipet line called Jurassasafe. Jurassasafe is a water conditioner specifically, formulated for aquatic reptiles. The difference in formulation is not super huge, but if you've got reptile customers, a lot of times they're very much going to want to know that the water conditioner or the product that they've used has been significantly tested on reptiles so that they can know for certain that it's safe. So Durasafe, Alpha, and Premier are the other major water conditioners in the Seachem, Aquavitro, and Durasapet lines. All right, so next up. As I've been touching on throughout these other slides, the nitrogen cycle is incredibly important for the health of the tank. This is one of those things that absolutely every new fish keeper hears about right there at the beginning. Before anything else, we all hear about the nitrogen cycle. But it's always going to be worth it to talk a little bit about it before we go into products that are going to supplement it. So, what is the nitrogen cycle? The nitrogen cycle is the process of breaking down fish waste into less toxic forms. Now, unfortunately, it does have to pass through several toxic forms before it reaches a point where we would consider it non-toxic to the fish. It takes around 1 to 2 months to completely cycle an aquarium. We can shorten that cycling time down significantly by supplementing additional bacteria colonies and by providing lots of good biomedia. But unfortunately, there's not currently a silver bullet to cycling. So we'll often have people want to cycle an aquarium in 3 days flat. And while it can be done, we've seen it happen, the likelihood of that occurring is incredibly low. So, as you can see from our little graph here, fish produce organic waste as well as ammonia. Ammonia gets converted into nitrite, nitrite gets converted into nitrate, and nitrate gets consumed by plants or consumed by anaerobic denitrifying bacteria colonies and converted into nitrogen gas. But I'm not going to go into that super far. So let's go through each of these steps real quick. First off, organic waste. This is going to be fish urine, fish feces, rotting plants, rotting wood, dissolved organic waste, stuff like that. This is usually what's going to contribute to clouding and foul odor. Is just a buildup of organic waste. So detritus, slimes, films, it's all organic waste. Next up, we've got ammonia. Ammonia can actually burn fish. It will prevent respiration, and of course in high concentration, you'll see ammonia burns, particularly on new fish coming in like a fish bag. Oftentimes they'll have burns on their sides, or you'll notice their slime coat sloughing off. That's going to be an ammonia burn, usually. Ammonia is much more dangerous in higher pHs. At a pH below 7.0, most of the ammonia is detoxified. But regardless of the pH, high concentrations of ammonia can burn the skin of the fish. So in this case, you can see on these poor goldfish, got a little bit of ammonia burns there on their side, which is no good. So next up. Nitrite. This is produced from the breakdown of ammonia. It's also toxic to the fish, but what this does is it gets into their bloodstream and prevents oxygen uptake. So the fish essentially suffocates while in perfectly well oxygenated water. This is also called brown blood disease. It'll cause a notable brownish discoloration on the gills. So a lot of times when a fish is gasping at the surface or hanging out in the bubble stream or hanging out right next to the filter outflow, the first thing that we'll recommend people check is going to be their nitrite levels, because that's an easy one to fix. Next up, we've got nitrate. So nitrate is produced from the breakdown of nitrite. This does tend to be stressful at high concentrations, but most fish will tolerate a bit of a buildup of nitrate before it becomes directly toxic to them. Typically what we see first before fish dying from, just plain old nitrate is that the higher concentrations of nitrate make the fish more susceptible to other infections. So oftentimes high nitrate concentrations will cause a fish to be susceptible to fin rot or various funguses. And of course, the most notable side effect of nitrate concentrations is going to be algae. So having very, very high nitrate levels will contribute to algae growth in the aquarium, whether your aquarium is planted or not. So what bacteria supplements do we offer? The first one, the one that everyone is most familiar with, is going to be stability. Stability contains all of the necessary bacteria to cycle a new tank. This is both the aerobic bacteria that will handle ammonia and nitrite. Side note, aerobic means oxygen loving. So aerobic bacteria prefers to live on surfaces that are exposed to a lot of oxygenated water. But stability is also going to supplement anaerobic bacteria. That's oxygen-hating bacteria. Oxygen-hating bacteria, anaerobic bacteria, prefers to live in surfaces which are exposed to very low oxygen water. So that's going to be inside porous biomedia, inside live rock, underneath the substrate, all kinds of places. But hopefully the majority of your aquarium is full of oxygen-rich water. So typically, you don't tend to have a huge amount of space for anaerobic bacteria unless you intentionally set your aquarium up that way, using something like matrix or pond matrix. Both of those types of media have lots and lots of space for anaerobic bacteria, and that anaerobic bacteria is what will take nitrate and convert it into nitrogen gas, which gases off from the aquarium. So that's kind of how the full nitrogen cycle works. So stability has a 4-year shelf life with no refrigeration required. The reason for that is that the bacteria in stability is in a spore form. It's not live bacteria. It's essentially a shelf-stable, you can think of it like bacteria seeds, where once you add it to the aquarium, the spore form bacteria, quote unquote, wakes up and finds a surface to attach to. But because it's not, alive in the bottle, swimming around trying to find food, you don't have to refrigerate it, and it has a very, very long shelf life. This is great for new systems, or you can add it as a part of regular maintenance. We recommend adding stability, when you're medicating or when something has happened to disturb the system, something like a very large water change. Next up, we've got Pristine. Pristine is a bacteria supplement specifically intended to resolve issues of organic waste buildup. That was that first slide that I showed with the slimes and the detritus and such. This is going to help, with this sort of organic buildup. I like to say that stability is for chemical problems that you can test in the aquarium, and Pristine is for physical problems that you can see or smell in the aquarium. You can also think of stability as being for a newer tank and Pristine for being for an older tank. Like stability, Pristine is going to have a 4-year shelf life with no refrigeration required because it's spore form bacteria. And this will work equally well in saltwater and freshwater. Okay. So next up, we're going to take a look at some problem solving in the aquarium. This is sort of the common issues that you're going to run into in new tanks. First off, clouding. We always have clouding in new aquariums. We even have clouding in older aquariums. But it's always worth asking, what is clouding? What causes clouding? All clouding is going to be due to microscopic particles forming in the water. That can be organic particles, like live particles like algae and bacteria, essentially in high enough quantities that they've started to become visible. And it can also be inorganic particles like dust and precipitation. So usually in a newer aquarium, the clouding that we're going to see is bacterial, but certainly green water, that sort of pea green soup, that's going to be algae clouding, which typically shows up when you have a little bit more of a phosphate concentration. So the steps of clearing clouding. First off, we would say it's important to identify the cause. What has caused these particles to form? Is it bacteria? Bacterial clouding is typically going to be white, and usually it's going to show up, over the course of several days. And usually bacterial clouding shows up either in new tanks or after a major aquarium upheaval. So, medication or a large water change or lots of gravel siphoning or a new filter gets put on the tank. All of that will cause enough of an upheaval to see some bacterial clouding. Algae clouding, of course, tends to be green. That's the strongest indicator that you have bacteria clouding. Typically, it's going to show up when you have higher phosphate concentrations in the water. Precipitant clouding, that happens when you've got a super high concentration of two different sort of chemical parameters in your tank. So for example, if you have super high GH and you also have super high phosphate, then those two are going to compete in the water and one of them is going to push the other one out of solution. So you tend to get precipitant clouding because you've got these high concentrations of chemicals that are pushing each other out of solution. And then the final one is dust. That's pretty straightforward. If you add a brand new substrate into the tank and you don't rinse it first, you're likely to get some dust clouding. Similarly, if you add a bunch of brand new filter media into the tank and don't rinse it, yeah, you'll see some dust clouding in the tank. So, an example of precipitant clouding. So this is that GH and phosphate precipitation that I was talking about. This is, of course, quite dramatic. You're not likely to see something this dramatic in an aquarium. But as you can see here, I've raised the GH concentration very, very high by adding lots of calcium. And then I start to add some phosphate. It's worth noting that both of these liquids are perfectly clear. So I pour my phosphate in, and it promptly precipitates out lots and lots of calcium. So that's no good. It's worth noting that typically precipitant clouding is not harmful. You're going to see precipitant clouding. It certainly looks unpleasant, and the large concentration of water parameters can themselves be a little bit stressful to the fish, but the precipitation itself is not toxic to the animal. Okay, so now that we know what has caused our clouding to appear, we need to address the cause. So in the case of bacteria clouding, typically that's going to be organics. So using something like Purigen will help to pull the organics out of the tank. We can also stabilize the water both by ensuring that the pH remains pretty stable and also avoiding major water changes that would cause water parameters to fluctuate. In the case of newer aquariums, sometimes it's just a matter of patience, ensuring that, we or the customer doesn't go a little bit crazy with trying to fix the problem and just, let the tank sort itself out. So avoiding instabilities is going to be a big one. In the case of algae clouding, reducing nitrate and phosphate concentrations will often help with that. So something like Phosbond or Phosguard will pull both phosphate and silicate out of the tank. Phosnet, of course, will also do that. For nitrate, doing water changes or introducing something like matrix or pond matrix will really help to, boost the nitrate removal capacity of your filter media. Addressing chemical imbalances is going to be important. This is one of those things that unfortunately one filter media won't do all on its own. Usually if you have enough of a chemical imbalance to cause precipitation, it means that there's been too much of a certain type of supplement added, or that your natural water has super high concentrations of minerals or carbonates that's causing precipitation in the water. And of course, dust clouding, just rinse your filter media first. Dust clouding is typically quite temporary, so by avoiding it in the first place, we can, prevent it entirely. All right, and finally, we need to remove the particles. The first step is to use a fine filter media like filter floss. Oftentimes, sort of standard sponges for the aquarium are not going to be fine enough to pull out these tiny particles. You can also dose a flocculating agent, which is what's in that video down below. A flocculating agent takes a bunch of particles, bacteria in this case, and clumps them together into a larger particle. And this larger particle can be much more easily removed by fine filter media. So by doing those two things together, fine filter media and also dosing a flocculating agent, we can remove the clouding manually. So what clarifier does Seachem offer? We offer clarity. This is a flocculating agent, so it's going to clear all forms of clouding. It doesn't matter whether your clouding is organic or inorganic, whether it's algae or bacteria, this will clear them all. It's not going to affect your other water parameters, so you're not going to see your GH fluctuating all over the place, anything like that from using this. It's important to use this one alongside fine filter media, because of course, if we clump all of our algae cells together into one big clump, but we still don't have any fine filter media to pull that clump out of the water, then it's just going to float around in the water, you know, looking like a big clump of algae. So, question is, does it even actually work? Because certainly we wouldn't want to tell you to purchase a product if it wasn't going to work for you. So, here's an example. I caused some precipitant clouding in this aquarium earlier on. I dosed some clarity in there. I'd stuffed that filter with a pretty decent amount of filter floss. And over the course of 2 hours, the aquarium clears entirely. If you use enough filter floss and you do a proper dose of clarity, your aquarium clears very, very quickly. Now you can use clarity as often as every day. So if you have, say, a display tank that you absolutely need to keep clear, it must be gorgeous every single day, but you've got a bit of bacteria clouding, then certainly dose clarity every day. It's perfectly fine. So next up, we're going to talk about stress. So what causes stress? Adapting to new water will certainly cause stress. So will transport trauma. New fish that come in have typically been knocked around and exposed to some ammonia and nitrite in their water. So they'll get some transport trauma. And of course, as we're all familiar, some customers are more gentle with their fish than others. On top of that, fish will tend to be aggressive with each other, especially when they're introduced into a new environment because they're trying to establish territories. There's lots of other things that will cause stress, but these are the major ones in new aquariums. So, how do we prevent stress? So you want to avoid instabilities in the aquarium. We want our water parameters to stay more or less the same. We want to avoid the inclusion of toxic chemicals in the water. So things like ammonia and nitrite, we want to keep those detoxified. Certainly, if we have any kind of buildup of ammonia or nitrite in the tank, that's not helpful, but the use of something like Prime will really, really help to avoid stress on the fish. We also want to choose our fish carefully to ensure that we don't have fish that are going to be very, very aggressive, kept in a tank with fish that are going to be gentle wimps, as it were. And of course, we want to use some kind of stress reducer that's going to help fish to recover from wounds and adapt to new water. So, stress guard. This is going to bind to basically exposed proteins in wounds to act as kind of a liquid bandage. This can help fish to recover from wounds and prevent infection on those wounds, especially right after transport or right after they've gotten into a fight with another fish. This is going to detoxify ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate just the same way Prime does, and it is pH neutral. That means you can use it in a fish bag if you want to. We've had many customers put something like Stress Guard in just a pump bottle so that they can, you know, put their fish into a bag, do a pump of Stress Guard into the bag with the fish, and then send it home with the customer. That helps to prevent that customer from coming back a week later and saying something like, you sold me a fish and now it's got fin rot, or you sold me a fish and now it's got ick, or something like that. By preventing the stress in the first place, we can keep that fish from getting an infection once it goes into the customer's tank. Now, this is safe for both reef and planted tanks, saltwater and freshwater. You can use it in any kind of aquarium and for any customer. The only thing we don't recommend using Stress Guard with is the medication cupramine. Don't use those two together. But other than that, very, nicely compatible with just about any type of aquarium setup. All right. And with that, I believe we are good to go. I'm going to unmute everybody. So, does anyone have any questions? Sure thing. Cupramine is basically copper bound onto an organic molecule, which is what makes cupramine much more stable for use in the aquarium. It prevents it from binding to rocks and it means that you've got a much larger window for effective treatment. Now, the trouble with that is that when you use cupramine together with a reducing agent, something like Prime, Safe, or Stress Guard, reducing agents are designed to break down other chemicals in the water. So if I use cupramine with Stress Guard, then the Stress Guard breaks the cupramine down into its elemental form. Basically, it breaks that copper off of the organic molecule. Now, elemental copper is much more toxic in much lower concentrations than this organic form of copper. So when you use Stress Guard and cupramine together, the Stress Guard makes the cupramine more toxic to the fish. In general, we don't recommend using cupramine with any other kind of treatment. So, this actually goes for most copper treatments. You kind of want to make sure that you're minimizing the use of other products to prevent product interactions.